All right, so let's look a little closer at that Fugitive Slave Act that we said is part of the Compromise of 1850. So remember I told you we talked about a Fugitive Slave Act back in the last unit, and the Fugitive Slave Act, it essentially said, if you're a runaway slave and we find you in a state, regardless of what state it is, whether slavery is legal or not in that state, if you are a slave, then you will be arrested and sent back to your owner. So that was the original fugitive slave law. This new fugitive slave law, it adds on to that, and it also makes assisting a runaway slave a federal offense. And assisting a runaway slave could be not just, working on the Underground Railroad, but, like feeding them or hiring a runaway slave. Or so this puts everyone in the country is now involved in this, and everyone has the ability to be impacted by this. It also allows the arrest of runaway slaves in states where slavery was illegal. So not just that we will take you away or we'll have to deport you and get you back and then we'll officially arrest you, but they can arrest you right there. So people being accused of being a runaway slave, they now have to provide documentation that they're free, and this is extremely difficult and sometimes impossible. Like you saw in 12 Years a Slave. This is around when what happened to Solomon Northup happened, when he was kidnapped and sold into slavery for 12 years. And this is essentially what goes on there. Not every free black in the United States has free papers, and it's sometimes difficult to keep up with and have on your person at all times. So even if a slave had gone to the North and lived there for years, they would still be sent back if they were caught. There was actually a case of a man who ran away and escaped slavery and lived in Indiana, where slavery was illegal. He lived in Indiana for 19 years. For 19 years he lived there and had his own life, and then one day they found out that he was a runaway slave and he had to be sent back after 19 years. Can you imagine? That just sounds horrible. So the people in the North absolutely hate this law. This is causing a lot of people to take a legitimate stance on slavery and fight for it. Like a lot of people before this in the North maybe thought slavery was morally wrong. But, they didn't know anyone with a slave. They didn't know any slaves. And in their mind, it was sort of out of sight, out of mind. They don't see any of that in their everyday life. So it wasn't anything that they thought about very much. But now, this really involves everyone. This is going to affect everyone. So now everyone is having to get involved. Either you're for it or you're against it at this point. There were even cases of mobs of people rescuing slaves from police stations in the North where they had been arrested. Slave catchers were being threatened all the time. And the South then was mad that the North reacted that way, and they threatened secession again. So, like you can see here, the secession now is just sort of this easy trigger. It seems like an empty threat. They just keep saying it, saying it, saying it. And the North is like, why don't you just do it already? You're not going to do it. Why are we even talking about this? Let's just make slavery illegal. So one of the biggest things to sort of show people in the North about the realities of slavery is going to be this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, this lady right here. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a magazine writer from Maine. And she used to live in Cincinnati, Ohio. And Cincinnati was a very important stop, actually, along the Underground Railroad. It's not that far from the South, and so a lot of slaves would end up in Cincinnati before they would break away somewhere else into the North. She is a descendant of Catherine Beecher. She actually taught at one of Catherine Beecher's schools, the Hartford Female Seminary, and so when she was working in education as a magazine writer, she got more involved in, the reform movement, and she eventually became an abolitionist along with being a writer. So in 1851, she published a series of stories about the cruelty and horror of slavery. And, a year later, her publisher was like, let's put it all together as a novel, and it'll bring more connectedness to all of these stories, and people will get more invested and emotionally connected to the characters. So in 1852, they published Uncle Tom's Cabin as one novel. Within a year, it had sold 300 copies in the United States and 1 million copies around the world. This was a worldwide bestseller instantly. If you've ever seen the movie or the play, The King and I, it's about the king of Siam in Asia, and they even hear about what's going on in the United States with our Civil War breaking out, and they even actually act out Uncle Tom's Cabin. They put on a play to represent in Siam Uncle Tom's Cabin, so all the way in Siam. So this is a huge, huge deal. So Southerners accused her of, writing lies about plantation life, because this is this book was very much graphic, and it went not necessarily graphic, but I mean it is, but it also gets more into sort of specifics, and you get emotionally connected to the characters, and it follows this family on this plantation, and you get to see what happens to everyone, and by the time people got to the end of the book, these are people who had never seen a slave before, never known a slave before, definitely no one who had really, I mean, I'm talking about the North here, definitely no one had really seen a lot of plantation slaves. And like I said before, we know plantation slavery is an entirely different monster from what we call yeoman slavery, which is sort of like small scale farming slavery. And people were really seeing the absolute horrors of what slavery was for the first time, and seeing it in a more realistic light. This is sort of the best way I can put it. Remember how you felt when we saw 12 Years a Slave, whether or not that was the first time when you seen it. Imagine the first time you did see it, whether it was on your own, at home, or in class. Imagine that was the first time you had ever seen or heard a true telling of slavery. So you knew that slaves had existed at one point in time, but you had never heard stories, you'd never seen a documentary or anything like that. You'd never seen or read anything about specific stories and examples of events that went on during the antebellum period with slaves in the South. And then all of a sudden you watch 12 Years a Slave. That's traumatizing, and it's a shock to your system to realize that people are being treated in such a cruel way. There was even so because of that, the South is like, oh, this is outrageous, this is a bunch of lies. It wasn't lies. It was obviously all accurate, and all of that really was happening, but the South took it to be the sort of plot by some crazy Northern Yankee lady to make the South look bad. There was even a newspaper in New Orleans that published a quote saying that there was never anything so detestable or monstrous among women as this. They basically say that Harriet Beecher Stowe has marked her entire gender, that she's making all women around the world look bad. So this actually takes the tension in the United States to a new level. This takes the hatred for slavery to a new height, and it takes the hatred in the South of the North to a new height, because they really resent her for doing this. When the Civil War finally breaks out, Abraham Lincoln eventually meets Harriet Beecher Stowe. When he meets her, he actually says, so this is the little lady who started this great war. He sort of accredited her in some way for getting the whole thing going. So Uncle Tom's Cabin is a huge piece of why the Civil War finally broke out.